So, where were you born and when?
I was born in Nebraska and actually on a farm close to a place called Broken Bow.
Hmm.
And that was 1940, long time ago.
What month?
March.
So is that Aries?
No, it's Pisces.
Pisces. And do you
Right.
identify with that at all? The two fish?
Well, in a jokey sort of way, my friend Brenda and I worked together for many years, and she was also a Pisces, and we said, we're not wishy-washy, we're flexible.
Yeah, and you have four fish, so that makes it stronger. That was Brenda Dunn, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Um, what kind of influence did you grow up with in that farm family, and what was their religious belief, and then how did that send you towards being a psychologist?
Well, it was really a farm family only for the first 5 years of my life. Then we moved to a small town, and a few years later to a somewhat larger town, the metropolis of North Platte, Nebraska. Then it had a population of about 15,000, and it was already then the fifth largest city in Nebraska at 15,000.
Wow.
So, I'm kind of, in other words, a bit of a small town boy. My parents were spiritually together and organized around morality and that kind of stuff, but nobody was a big churchgoer except my oldest brother, who was crippled from birth, and he found that a very good social place to be.
Mm-hmm.
But
And
my religious background isn't conventional parishes or churches, that sort of thing, so much as a kind of curiosity about the spiritual aspects of life, which eventually I was able to um, develop into my own version of spiritual being, which is basically the same as my parents. Try to be a decent person. Make sure you pay attention to the golden rule. Think about the golden braid, which is my way of thinking that there is a commonality to all spiritual traditions and indeed religions, which is a lot overwritten by the organized religions, unfortunately. The golden braid is the core. It has to do with actually the spirituality and not the religiosity.
I
So,
remember
yeah.
Houston Smith said that what he saw as the commonalities were belief in the afterlife, uh, cause and effect, a higher being. Does the golden braid fit into that?
Not really. It's more about our personal relationship to each other, to the world, and so forth. It has to do more with ethics and morality than with beliefs about afterlives and um, any of those kind of religious traditions.
Got
In
it.
other words, it's not religious at all; it's spiritual.
Got it. Um, and then how did you get from Nebraska to Vermont and to New Jersey?
Well, it's a long story, but I was a good student. I got a scholarship to the University of Rochester, New York, and so I left the small town um, where I grew up, you might say, in my small town community, and became um, you know connected to the larger world by way of Rochester and then New York City and so on. I went to the military at some point and wound up being in Germany, so I became therefore a little bit more, I guess, worldly cosmopolitan, and I learned another language, I learned another culture, and traveled around Europe quite a bit, and sort of expanded my horizons. Came back thinking I would be a photographer, but I wound up being a graduate student in psychology at New York University and then later Columbia. And when I finished with all of that, I took a teaching job in northern Vermont in a small college, which was delightful and beautiful, and I stayed there with my family, my wife and son, who was then 3 years old when we moved. And in 1980, I had become a little discontented with the position there because it seemed to me that this college was working toward becoming a sharply focused diploma mill rather than a liberal arts institution, which is my idea of college. And so I saw an ad for a job in Princeton at the university, and I thought, wow, I'll check that out. And I met the people, liked them, we liked each other, and there were quite a number of people interested in the job. But my combination of qualities led to me having that job, and I spent, well, I don't know, I'm already past the place where you asked about how to get to Vermont.
No, that's
now I'm
fine.
already in Princeton, right?
Before we leave Germany, why isn't your Der Weltgeist available in English? Your book.
Well, it may be. It was only published this year, so
I didn't see it on Amazon.
it's not published in English yet. It's only published in German
Yeah, I'm wondering why it's not in
because
English.
it hasn't been translated yet.
Got it. So you
Um,
wrote
well,
it in German?
I have another book which is due to be published in the early spring, which is in English. It's called "We Are All Connected," and it's the story of the Global Consciousness Project. It will be published by ICRL Press, and probably I'm hoping it'll be in perhaps March.
Congratulations. That's like a
Thank
bird.
you.
What have been your most difficult challenges in your life, and how did you deal with those challenges?
I've led a charmed life and never met any challenges. That's of course not true, but basically I've been quite fortunate. You know, I have been basically healthy and never, since I'm white, I never got arrested for being black, for example. And so I mean, basically I'm a white middle class person with the kind of credentials and background that allows me to get jobs and make a living. And let me put it in a more positive sense, I have been fortunate enough to fall into things that were that suited my interest and suited my skills and my personal mission in life, you might say. So one chapter in my new book is called Design by Coincidence. So I have a long history of things falling into place because it seems they were supposed to be. They're part of a sequence. And so...
Give us an example.
Yeah. Sorry, me?
I'm sorry. Give us an example of a juicy one.
Well, when I started the Global Consciousness Project in 1997, several things. I mean, there were any number of other kinds of things, but a couple of examples are that I was looking online for what amounts to a logo. I wanted to have a very beautiful picture of the Earth, which I was thinking we human beings in potential are covering with a kind of noosphere, a sphere of intelligence. And in the course of looking, I found this wonderful website called Formulab, Fourmilab, run by a guy named John Walker, who is a consummate technologist. He actually he created a huge corporation, the beginnings of a corporation called Autodesk, which provides to big businesses and universities the best computer software for CAD drawings and so forth. Anyway, I've coincidentally discovered that John was now sponsoring and running an experiment that I had helped some other people set up a few years earlier. and they couldn't run it anymore. John took it over. It was an online random number generator experiment where anybody in the world could try changing the way random numbers would flow. And so I got in touch with him, and he was interested in my global consciousness project. He thought it would be something like a super collider for parapsychology. and and he started building software. Meanwhile, my son, who is also a consummate techie and excellent programmer, had, by coincidence, a period of time when he didn't have, he wasn't overloaded with commitments of various kinds, so he had time to think about my project and help me imagine how it would work technically and in terms of software. So he created the architecture for the Global Consciousness Project. This is 1997, early 1998. That software, was then enhanced with some back and forth collaboration between my son Greg and John Walker. And, software changes every 3 months or every year in the world that most of us know. This has been running perfectly, adequately for 20 years, from 1998 until now.
Wow.
So these guys are good, right? And it's just a coincidence that I met John and that my son happened to have time and so forth.
Is that site still available online?
Oh, yeah. It's, the website is global-mind.org.
So people can play with the random number generators themselves?
No, they can't play with them themselves. The random number generator. Oh, you're talking about the Formulab site. Yes, that is still online.
And what's it called?
Well, it's FOURMILAB, I believe, .com. Not 100% sure, but if you look up FOURMILAB, you will find Formulab.com, and then look through the menu and you'll find the online experiment.
But can people still go on and try it themselves?
Yes, on Formulab, yes, that's still running.
Great. Mm-hmm. And what kind of outcomes have you had in terms of statistical probability that the outcomes would be what they are?
Are you talking about Formulab or the Global Consciousness Project?
Let's do Formulab first.
Well, I don't run that site. That's my friend John, John Walker. He has an entire, a history of the entire project that you can look at. The probabilities against chance for the results go up and down, and I don't know for sure about this, but he probably splits it up a little bit into categories of people who do a lot of trials and people who do only one, that sort of thing. But I really just don't know the details of that project. It's not something I keep track of.
A lot of scientists find that if they're working on a problem, they wake up with the solution or they dream about it. Have you found that you access information in that kind of non-local way, shall we say?
Sometimes, yeah. Speaking of dreams, I had a couple of them that were relevant to the Global Consciousness Project. That one's too esoteric. Nobody would understand it. But here's one.
Okay.
I woke up, and I don't remember dreams usually, but once in a while I have one that's so interesting, and when I wake up, I make some notes, and then I can remember. In this one, I had received a very large package, a big box, and it came with instructions. And the instructions said to push this button, and so on. And when I started following the instructions, push the button and a flap opened and a thin transparent tube rolled out into a kind of chute. And then it started kind of making groaning sounds. And I could sort of feel that there was something difficult and urgent going on.
Like a birth
inside.
process.
Okay, and then pretty soon that clear plastic tube expanded and a furry mass came out and eventually plopped into the receiving tray, and it was a very small paw from a lion that was now, moist and matted. And this was basically a practice session for birthing a lion. Why was it instructive or important? It was exactly at the time I was setting up the logistics for the Global Consciousness Project. And there were, a number of possibilities for people who would take care of the money. I didn't want to do a 501c3 myself, so I needed somebody to take care of the money. And I had talked to a certain group, and they said, "Oh, that's going to cost $250,000, and I don't think we can handle it." And it turns out that we haven't spent that much in 20 years, I'm quite sure. In any case, I was at a point where it was not a struggle so much as just a lot of urgent, necessary work to do. And basically it was telling me that this is a project that's going to require you to really buckle down or buckle up and work at it. So
it sounds like a birth experience. So it's the birth pangs and the labor that goes along with a birth.
absolutely, absolutely, it's exactly what it was.
Yeah.
There was a surrogate in this box in the form of a lion, but the birth pains were very real. I mean, and the urgency and the struggle and the necessity, all of those things were wrapped up in a package that I received in my dream.
Got it.
It was quite nice.
Got it.
I used the I Ching a few times, every once in a while. You're familiar, no doubt. Most people are. And I don't do it often. I do it once in a while when there's a kind of personal question or set of issues or whatever that seem to be they could use some good advice from the ancient wise ones. And the I Ching has never failed. It was it based. One time it had to do with the people I might work with or not, and basically the I Ching provides you some suggestions along the lines of what's the correct way to proceed when you're dealing with other people and working together with other people to solve problems and so forth. Wonderful advice from the I Ching every time I use it, which is maybe half a dozen times over the last 20 years.
In dealing with that group of people, what did the I Ching suggest in a nutshell?
Would you say it again, please?
When you asked the I Ching about working with this group of people, what was the guidance that you got from throwing the sticks?
Basically, the guidance was to be sure that I was on a correct path, a righteous path, and that anybody I contacted not only could perceive that, but respond in kind.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Before we get to the Consciousness Project, a lot of people that I've interviewed meditate. Is that something that you include in your life?
Yes.
What form works for you?
Well, my first contact with this whole area at the frontiers of what people think of as science was in Nebraska when I was a high school kid. I wanted to learn judo or jiu-jitsu or some martial arts, right? So I went to the local Carnegie library, and they didn't have any books like that, but in the section where I was looking, there was one on yoga, written by an Indian and a German together. And this combination of Western and Eastern understanding of what yoga was about was a beautiful, beautiful introduction for me into that path, and that included some meditation. But my real deeper introduction came through a retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh, who's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And I've, for many years, been basically my meditation amounts to doing what I learned from Thich Nhat Hanh, and it's essentially um, being, calming yourself, sitting quietly, making sure that all is well, and then relaxing into an understanding of things like when I'm breathing in, I calm my body. Breathing out, I smile. Or breathing in, I see myself as a flower. And breathing out, I feel fresh. These kinds of things, you can gradually build up a kind of mantra, but many of them, all of which are guidance about behavior in your life. And then part of the meditation is simply breathing. Just that's probably the deeper part. Just relaxing, being as calm and trying to get out of my own way.
It's always a challenge to calm the monkey mind. And are you able to quiet the mind when you're meditating?
Not easily, and not often, but I don't worry about it, and that calms the monkey mind quite a lot. So.
That's brilliant. Okay, when you started the working with rings, how did you even know about them? What was the impetus? How did you? I know Tiller was working with them at Stanford. Was there any connection between him and you on the rings?
Are you talking about RNGs?
Yeah.
Random number generators? Well, I started working with them at Princeton. I hadn't used them before, and that was 1980. And eventually, we started with commercial sources of random numbers, things that are used by people for cryptology in the government or for necessary random source work in industry and so forth. And then gradually we needed other kinds of things, so we started building our own. I know William Tiller, but the work that you're probably thinking of was, I think, done a fair amount later, probably in the early 1990s or something like that. And I've never tried to do the kind of thing that he talks about, which is to imprint some kind of consciousness state into some kind of electro or mechanical device. But he's an interesting person. My background, the precedent, I guess, was a man named Helmut Schmidt. He was a physicist who worked for Boeing aircraft when he started thinking about these things and wondering whether random number generators might possibly be susceptible to influence from consciousness for good reasons. I won't go into all that history, but he became the man, the source of a lot of I guess you might say inspirational work, but he was all by himself. And eventually other people started picking up, and we were, in a sense, replicating his work at Princeton.
You're a psychologist, but you were working with engineers. How did the two of you get together, or the group?
We were a very diverse group. We were the classic multi or interdisciplinary group. We had a couple of physicists, an astrophysicist, electrical engineer, a philosopher, and two psychologists in the group when it was at its largest, and lots of other people coming in too. But your question has to do with how does a psychologist get together with engineers? Well, I'm actually a kind of on-the-job trained engineer, I was interested in physics and chemistry before I was interested in psychology. I went to psychology because I didn't have enough time to do the sculpture that I was most interested in and the physics that I was nominally majoring in college. Can you excuse me for a half a minute?
Sure.
Are you familiar with Dean Radin's
Oh, yeah.
experiments with, the double slit experiment? He has people basically observe or not observe the electron or photon as it's passing through the double slit apparatus, and it makes a difference. And he has, I think, done a remarkable job of showing that you can think about it, you can speculate and so forth, but he has defined an experiment in such a way that really appears that the consciousness of the observer does literally, factually change the behavior of this quantum system.
I read that Princeton graduation has less rainfall than would ordinarily be predicted because people don't want it to rain during graduation. Is that true?
Well, I mean, that's an experiment I did as a natural experiment. When I came to Princeton, I happened to arrive about the time they were going to have this P-Raid thing, and it was a beautiful day, and lots of people having a wonderful time celebrating their long friendships and that kind of stuff. And then I tended with my wife and son to go to these things next year, and so on. And I began to notice that people were saying, "Look, it's beautiful again. It's Princeton, of course." And Princeton at that time had a weather station. They don't anymore, but for 30 years they had a weather station, and I decided, why not get the data, government data, on what the weather is like in Princeton and 6 other towns around. And when I compared them on these days when everybody is gathered outside for various kinds of events, there was a tendency, there was a statistically significant tendency for the weather to be a little better, a little more often, or putting it in negative terms, less rain, less often. It was wonderful. So the paper, which is one of my favorite papers ever, of things I've written, called Wishing for Good Weather. And the end of the paper says something like, given these results, it appears that the old saw about how everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it, we have to rethink that. So, I mean, there are lots of anecdotal and anthropological records and whatnot of people who affect the weather. The Dalai Lama, when I presented that, a guy who spent a lot of time in India said, "Oh, that's a known fact. The Dalai Lama has an anti-rainmaker." And he said, "I was there for one of these huge gatherings of, I don't know, thousands or tens of thousands of people, and it was threatening rain. So the anti-rainmakers went to work, and sure enough, it did not rain during the ceremony of where these thousands and thousands of people were gathered." I've seen it otherwise too. So, and some of the Indian shamans, Native American shamans, have that as part of their mission to make sure that the weather works as best it can be arranged for the crops and for the needs of the people.
Do you think with the internet that enables us to have a more integrated global mind, so that could be like a tool to think peace or equality or something like that?
Yes, I do think so. I mean, the internet and mobile phones, maybe even more, the latter, are technology that allows us to connect with people that are thousands of miles or completely on the other side of the world. And we now have friendships between people who are in China and California and friendships between New Zealand and Alaska and so on. People who wouldn't have even known the other existed without the internet. So it's a kind of, mechanical version of the same kind of thing. And probably what we have to always understand that the physical and the material and the spiritual aren't really opposed or opposite to each other at all. They are complementary aspects of the world. So I would say maybe the noosphere, which is what I talk about and what these experiments show, is made of nothing but information. And the blogosphere and the internet, those things which are made of electrons flowing and wireless radio waves and whatnot, those things are complementary aspects of what is going to be emerging, I think, I hope, as a global community more and more as time goes on. We have a tremendous amount of strife, and I personally think it's driven a whole lot by the worst of our tendencies, things like greed and selfishness and so on. But if we can learn somehow to either en masse or enough of us to get over that, so that we're able to work toward developing the full potential we have as human beings, then the global internet and the global consciousness will become a kind of really high quality complementary structure for us to be one people around the planet.
Does that mean that you're hopeful? Because it's hard to be hopeful in the face of global warming and climate change and how radically we're destroying the planet and all the autocrats that are being elected around the world. It's easy to think, oh, we're doomed, but it sounds like you're hopeful.
I'm a congenital optimist, and so I have. But I mean, I totally am. I'm so frustrated and so sad, and and sometimes I'm, if I get really into a terrible bad mood about it, I would think something like, well, I hope we kill ourselves fast because we're hurting our planet and all the animals, every living being on the planet so badly, so much. We've killed 60,000 species in the last few years. It's like, oh, it's horrifying. And yet there are signs all over the place. And anybody who's asking the kind of questions you are and I am, the answer that we see are that yes, lots and lots of people are waking up. We don't, as a coherent group, we don't yet know how to make it work, but we are at least aware of the question. Once you have a well-formed question, the answer is just really right around the corner, I think. So I'm optimistic, and because there are so many beautiful, thoughtful people and groups working toward a brighter future. So they're up against a tough one, for sure.
Sometimes,
but if we can only, yeah.
Sometimes I'm sorry.
I just want to mention before I forget it, my friend Stefan Schwartz, who is one of the most productive people I know. He has spent much of the last several years working on what might be simply put as promoting wellness as a kind of criterion, as a goal, as a way of being on the earth. If we, instead of measuring our success in terms of how much money we have, measure instead in terms of how much wellness is created, it would be, the job would be done. And the problem or the difficulty that we have to face is how to talk to people on the other side of the fence. People don't think that way, and who do think instead that the more I have, the better I am, or the happier I will be. And it's easy to discover scientific studies, for example, and also personal testimony that acquisition doesn't really make people happy. But at some level, I think maybe we have so malconditioned ourselves that a lot of us think there's just no question about it. We don't have any choice. We have to strive and gather as much as and consume as much as we possibly can. We have no idea what else to do. You know? We've forgotten how to be in families. We've forgotten how to be good neighbors. We've forgotten how to be compassionate. That's the saddest part of it.
What I was going to say is sometimes it seems to me that Trump is like bringing out all the shadow, ugliness, negative, greed, so that it can come in the surface and kind of be illuminated, and that's part of the process. That's what I hope, is that he's...
Yeah, well, I do too, and I think a lot of people, yeah, we're not alone. An awful lot of people talk about that, and I'm sure it's true. And all that's really required is for that. It's like I haven't heard anybody talk about a boil, like something on your face or your neck or something that's like a festering wound. That's what we have. The thing has to be pierced, or it has to naturally break open, and all that nasty stuff needs to just be cleaned out. Then we could get back to being healthy. But it's really hard to see what. I mean, I guess the rule that we all need to follow. There's a bunch of ways to put this. One of Stefan's books is called The 8 Laws, and basically they're all about trying to be a really fully qualified, fully representative human being, working up to being the best human being you can be. My goodness, if you think about the really good ones and aspire to be like that, well, if that were a widespread tendency, then people would stop trying to be like Trump, or stop trying to be like any greedy CEO, and instead trying to be more like a saint. So it's a long way between the saints and the CEOs, but that's the road, that's the path.
Right. I wanted to ask you before I ask you about what you do for fun. Princeton prides itself on being this Ivy League, high prestige, scholarly place, and I'm wondering if you got flack from colleagues who said, "What? They're working with intention on machines in the Pear Lab? What are they doing?"
Yes. Well, yes. There was plenty of flack like that. In fact, the guy who started the lab, Bob John, wonderful person, was. I think he was happy that he was able to create the lab and allow some flowering of understanding of things that were difficult to deal with, to manage and understand. Anyway. His greatest regret, I think, might have been, he spoke of it once or twice, was that he didn't have much time left over from defending the lab from all those critics and sometimes very active oppositional forces within the university. He had to defend us from that, and he said, you guys work, I'll take care of this. He did, and the lab maintained a functional, active, productive presence for all those years. But he had to sacrifice the time. He would have liked to be in the lab getting his hands dirty.
I bet. And he was an engineer?
I'm sorry?
He was an engineer? Johns? He was an engineer?
Oh, yeah. He was actually a physicist and an engineer. He was his career before he started the Pear Lab was, besides being on the faculty teaching things like mechanical and aerospace engineering, that's the department, he was the head of what was called the Plasma Propulsion Lab. It was a laboratory with NASA funding developing the spacecraft engines of the future. They are now, that lab's work has been successful. There are now crafts going around the solar system propelled by engines developed in that plasma propulsion lab, which he started. So he was and his career included a lot of things having to do with engineering. He was a major figure in academic engineering. And also, I think his textbook on plasma physics is still the go-to textbook for that field. He wrote that in probably 1975 or something. So a book that lasts for 40 or 50 years is a good book.
So what have you done for fun over the years in the face of all this research, writing, producing, teaching, family? How do you have balance and have fun?
I saw that question and I thought, well, what's not fun? I have hobbies and so forth, but I mean, I do some photography and still a little sculpture. I build things and fix things and all of that. But to be honest with you, I love being with people who are. Not everybody will recognize the word salon, but I love being in a salon, which is a group of people who are in conversation.
SALON.
SALON, yeah.
Yeah.
It's an old, I think comes from French, 18th century or something like that.
Yeah.
It was like the drawing room gatherings where people who had, maybe different interests, but were each deeply interested in whatever it was, would come together and talk about these things. I love that. So that's fun. And it's stimulating at a deep level. You become a bigger, better person as a result of conversation with other people who are, like you, looking for an exchange of ideas and sometimes profound discoveries.
And are you involved in something like that now?
Yes, I have a small men's group that gathers, and that's what we do. And that we have friends who also enjoy these same kinds of things. I'm especially thinking about it, and that word came to mind because of gathering some neighbors across the street with 4 or 5 couples who were all just ready to talk. It doesn't have to be anything in particular, but profoundly interesting.
Mm.
So I'm also, very much interested in gardening and the kind of sustainable living. We belong to a community in upstate New York called Whitehawk, which is an intentional community that's growing. It's about 1/3 of its intended size. It will have 30 families when it's full, and all the people I don't want to go into too much detail, but basically these are people who have decided they want to be responsible, they want to be friends, they want to have and they want to do service for and be available, and all of these kinds of human qualities that are the thing that we're built for to begin with. And nobody is convinced that it's a good idea to make even more money. Enough is good, and enough is enough. And so these people are all interested in making sure that the land for which they're responsible is cared for rather than exploited. So the tendency of people, and this is driven a lot by religions, to believe that we are intended to have dominion over the earth That's a direct line out of some translations of the Bible, Christian Bible. Probably the same thing that exists in the other ones. I know that, well, not too much of that.
Yeah, it's
But
Old Testament.
that word, dominion, has been translated as powerful control and something like suppression. But what it should mean is responsible husbandry, the
Right.
kind of caretaking that everything needs if it's to survive or if it's to prosper.
Are you going to move there? Live there?
Well, we do have a house there, but at the present time we love Princeton. We live in a place where we can walk to the stores and walk to the university, and where it's easy to travel if we are going to Europe or South America or something like that. It's easy to do all of that stuff and enlarge our carbon footprint.
Yeah.
So, but at some point, I think we may very well move there and become more completely integrated into that community. As it is, we participate some, but it's difficult. So the house we build is now an incubator for other houses. People come, they want to build, they would like to be there to watch their own house being built. So we're providing kind of by accident that opportunity.
Do you have another book after the one that's coming out in the spring that you're percolating, or what's your next writing focus?
I wrote the book in Germany with a co-author. His name is Georg Kindle, and that's the Der Weltgeist, and he wants to do another one, and we might talk about it sometime later this month. But otherwise, I mean, I sometimes think, there are books and books and books, and they're like part of the book that I'm working toward being publishing in the spring. Part of that is, I mean, the whole last chapter is just pieces of wisdom from that I've come across. It's such beautiful stuff.
Mm.
That kind of thing can, and this is, other people have done this already, but we each have our own perspective, and so I think that in one form or another, that might be a good thing for the next book to be. Basically, the one I'm doing now is documenting this project and providing access to the results in a way that the website is too complicated for. And on the other hand, the mission that I've adopted when I give talks in the last few years is not so much, I mean, I give a bit of background on how the whole thing works, but then I wind up, and I think people appreciate it, I wind up talking about what it means, what we should take from it, and how we should proceed if we believe this is telling us something about the way the real world is. What's next? And there's a tremendous amount of wisdom about that we come across accidentally, and we should gather that and focus it. So maybe that's what I would do next.
So, in a nutshell, what would that be? What's next?
Okay, yeah, that's a good title. What's next? We know we've got problems, folks. Now, what's next? How do we mature as human beings? I would just love it if we would, if that were a goal that vast numbers, really huge numbers of people have. How do we become the best human being that is possible? And we know from examples, we know from thinking about it, a priori, practically, that there's a lot of room between where we are and where we could be as human beings. There is so much room there, and we don't think about it very much. And on the other hand, it's not so hard. It's not an impossible task. It's just a matter of focusing and asking yourself the question and then seeking the answer to this question. What's next? How do I become, how do I live up to my potential as a human being? and how, again, another version of what's next, having achieved, having at least asked the question for myself, how can I make it possible for other people to take on the same, to step onto the same path? If we get vast numbers of people to do that, well, we had a sign, a little tiny sign in the lab that says, if we all work together, we can totally subvert the system. And it's another form. If we all work together, we can totally make a beautiful universe for ourselves to be in.
That is so true.
Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be preferable to what it is now? Even if you're at the top of the heap in economic terms and so forth, why wouldn't it be preferable for you at the top of your heap to look around and see beauty instead of kind of sadness and tragedy and chaos?
Good. Let me ask you before we go, who else should be in the book? Who would you suggest as a visionary scientist that you would like to see in a chapter next to you?
Well, I don't know who all you have already, but Dean, if you don't have him, be sure to talk to him. Have you talked to him already?
Yeah.
Rupert Sheldrake?
I queried him. He said he's really busy.
Oh, yeah. He's a little hard to get to. Stefan Schwartz, if you don't have him, he's marvelous.
Where is he? Where does he live?
On Whidbey Island in Seattle. Not in Seattle, it's off the coast. You can look him up online. He has he publishes something called the Schwartz Report. But of course you can put Stefan, Stephan, Schwartz into Google and find him. Cassie Veaton, you know her?
Mm-mm.
She's the president, I think, of Institute of Noetic Sciences at the present time, and she's marvelous.
How do you spell her last name?
Vieton. Oh, maybe it's Vieten. I'm not quite sure. I guess her real name is Cassandra, but she goes by Cassie. Cassie. She's at IONS, which is noetic.org, I think. Another person there, Julia Mossbridge. I
contacted her. She's busy.
You okay? Yeah, she is. That's real. Roland McCraty, Rollin McCraty. If you could, another busy one, Irvin Laszlo, Laszlo. He's Hungarian, but he speaks English and French and Italian and God knows what all other languages. He lives in Italy. But
he's in Switzerland?
No, Italy.
Okay. All right.
I mean, he might be in Switzerland some of the time.
Okay.
But he's older, but he's fantastic.
Great.
Anyway, I mean, we're all older. Okay, so any last questions? I must run.
I think so. It was an eclectic group, and you trained yourself to be an engineer.
Not really. I was a physicist first, then I became a psychologist, and because my family history included things like building stuff, I was kind of an engineer. But it was a cooperative group. We Brenda once said she was looking at three of us, considering what we were engaged in, which was repairing and refining an experiment that somebody else had built, which was unfortunately a little crude. And she said, "I see a pit crew." So we work together like a pit crew does. Somebody puts the tire on, somebody fills the gas tank, somebody makes sure that the windshield is clean, that sort of thing.
Got it.
Yeah.
So what surprised you about the findings? What did you find in terms of what human intention can do to change the the generation of zeros and ones?
You know, that's an interesting question. It's not one I can answer quite the way you think. But what surprised me, I guess, most about this whole 25 or 30 years I've been working in this area is that it shows a persistent, small but real effect. And nothing we do in the experiments ever seems to make it go away. You know, one of the best practices for people working in difficult experiments is to try everything you can think of to make the effect disappear. If you can't do it, if you tried everything to make it disappear, then it probably can't be made to disappear because it's the real thing. It's not a fantasy or a fraudulent presentation or anything, that kind of stuff. It's the world speaking to us through science about the way the world is.
I want to get to that, but if I sit and read a book and I'm in front of the generator and I'm totally focused on my book, do I still have an impact, or do I need to be thinking coherence, coherence, coherence?
Probably it's much better to just forget about it and read the book.
Oh, why?
Yeah. The reason I say that is from experience. People are individually different. Some people probably may do well if they work at being focused on the task of changing the numbers. But most people, in our experience, are better setting the intention and then relaxing and getting out of the way. And that's not so easy to do, but it works very well. If people are, it's a little bit like the meditation. It's a little bit like calming the monkey mind. The monkey mind throws a monkey wrench into the process of connecting with the world or with other people or with random number generators, for that matter.
I read somewhere that like two people in love, they have more influence than two people who aren't entangled, who don't really know each other, sitting in front of the machine.
Yes, that's one of the experiments that we did in the Pear Lab, which was, I think, profoundly informative. Among other things, the effect size for the two people who we call bonded pairs, that basically means they love each other, was bigger than either of them had by themselves. So it's even more, the differentiation is even different from what you had read. It isn't just that they're better than people who aren't bonded, it's better than they are themselves when they're not bonded together. So basically, I think I can give you a hand-waving explanation. What does it mean to be in love or bonded? It means that the two separate entities have become one, and the business of being in love or coming to be bonded or coming to be one is practice for trying to do that same thing with the random number generator. Now you got this sort of box sitting on the table, which is producing random numbers, and you might think it's not reasonable to fall in love with it, but if you can, it's more likely to cooperate with you. It's more likely to absorb the information that you are trying to provide to it in the form of your intentions to get high numbers or low numbers.
Before we go into the non-local consciousness explanation, how did this multiply to be a global project?
We first did experiments for about 10 years with individuals trying to change the behavior of these machines, and with sufficient success that we thought it was good to replicate. We started building smaller machines. We eventually built them small enough that you could put it in your pocket and take it out into the field. And we did field REG experiments, we called them field ray. We went to concerts, we went to churches, we went to rituals of various kinds, all
And
kinds interesting
academic,
places.
and you went
What?
to academic gatherings and they didn't have the coherence. Ac-
Well,
Academic conferences, which I think is great that you had that result.
okay, yeah, right. An academic conference isn't something that produces a lot of coherence, right? Or a street corner or a train station. None of those places are likely to produce any patterns in the data. But a ritual um, anywhere, and out in the woods, pagan kinds of things, or in a church, Christmas celebration or whatever, those things very regularly produce patterns in our data. So that field rate experience, basically what we were looking at was group consciousness. That's the way we thought of it. We were looking at a kind of field produced by a group of people, a field of consciousness or information, which had structure because that's what we do. We structure information to be awake or conscious or whatever. That structured information gets absorbed into the random number generators and becomes the pattern that we see in the data, you might say. So after doing that for a while, there are a lot of obvious questions that begin to pop up. What if you have two of these devices? And what if your group isn't local, but instead in a different town? And so eventually that led to my asking a bunch of my friends and colleagues around the world doing research with random number generators, please take data during this event. There was a Gaia Mind meditation, this is another one of those wonderful coincidences. I was at Esalen in the hot tubs, and there was a young couple there who I thought were just beautiful, and we started talking. It turned out that what they were doing, they had just stopped in briefly. They were on a mission to publicize and organize a global meditation, which they called Gaia Mind Meditation, in early 1997. And I was at that very same time, I was at Esalen because I was talking about group consciousness and that sort of thing. And I had been speculating about Teilhard de Chardin's idea of noosphere and global consciousness. And so here are these people setting up an experiment exactly like I wanted. So I sent off notes to all my friends. Please take the data, send it to me. And we had a big splashing difference from what's expected during the time of this Gaia Mind meditation. And not long after that, Princess Diana was killed. And that became the second, maybe even more rigorous prototype for what became the Global Consciousness Project. Again, I asked my friends, please take data during this funeral gathering. We know that there will be millions, and estimates were that there were like 2 billion people all paying attention to what was happening at the same time. They were all watching these young children, Harry and William, walking alongside their mother's hearse, and so on. So in other words, it was a gathering of consciousness, a very clear and obvious gathering of global consciousness, focused and coherent because of the circumstances. So I thought it was a perfect opportunity. We did the same kind of thing, asked all my friends to send data, and the results, again, were 100 to 1 odds that if you somehow managed to do that again, you would get such a thing by chance. It would take 100 experiments like that to get the results we got if it wasn't a real effect, but instead just chance. So that's the material of encouragement to go ahead and make a permanent listening network to ask the question whether global consciousness might really exist in a nascent form of baby, like maybe not even born yet, but at least in some sort of gestation. And so I gathered resources, and pretty soon my son got to work, my friend John Walker, and Dean Radin and I and Dick Bierman and a few other people talked about experimental designs and so forth, and we were off and running. And by 1998, in August, we were able to begin taking data actually as a network and asking what happened if a huge event, again, brought a global focus, a coherent focus on some, because of some event. And the first one that we looked at was, this is what many people who read or listen to what I'm saying will not remember, the embassy bombings in Africa. There were 2 embassies bombed in August of 1998. It was such a horrific shredding of the social contract that I thought, and it really was a big news thing. It spread very rapidly around the world and so forth. So it was an obvious event to become to be part of the experimental question we were asking. Would our network of random number generators respond in some way during that period of time? And then, so we started, and at the very beginning, we had to learn what kind of event makes sense to ask about. And we asked about tragedies, and we asked about sporting events, and we asked about celebrations like New Year's and Kumbh Mela in India, and all kinds of accidents and natural disasters and so forth. Gradually honing in on a fairly rigorous set of the kinds of events that we would look at. We knew that it was going to be a small effect, or expected it would be, so we knew that we would have to repeat the same experiment again and again and again in order to pull the signal out of the noise.
So you have over 500 events that were the information was collected in this way. Is it still happening?
Yes, this network is still running. I ended what we called formal series, where there's a specification for each event that says when does it begin, when does it end, what kind of analysis are we doing for this segment of data. We did 500 of those in the formal fashion. I'm still doing events occasionally when there's something that appears, to be important. A kind of horrifying natural disaster, or
the
one of the
election of Trump.
tsunami that kills. Anyway, we're still doing it, but it's no longer part of the. We're now just in an exploratory mode. I keep it running partly because, I can, and I like the possibility of being able, just in case something really obvious grabs hold of us in this world, we'll be able to look at it, and from the point of view of this question about global consciousness.
What were the other big effects besides Princess Di's death? I read somewhere that the World Trade Tower attack was also really big.
Yes, that was. I think I was like in two or 2.5 years later, 2001, September, was number 80 in the series. I remember that. That was the 80th of our 500 events. It was huge in both the obvious sense that everybody understands. You're seeing something like that happen, a massive disaster affecting killing thousands of people. And then basically we didn't know how much at the time, but it changed the way the world is. That's a major event. And our data, if you think about a kind of random walk, the way we display the data, it should just be wandering up and down a little bit, but basically a level trend. On 9/11, it was wandering this fashion, and on the 9th and the 10th and so forth. And then early on the 11th, it started going like this, not in a level horizontal line. And it continued to be divergent from what's expected of random numbers for 3 days, which is just it's not something that we look through the data to see if there's anything else like this. There was nothing else like this at the time in 3 years of data.
The fact
There really
that
hasn't been anything quite like it since then either.
the fact that it started having an effect before the planes hit, does that mean that our sense of time that it's not linear, that the future bleeds into the present, or was it just like the emotionality of the attackers, or what's your guess as to why it started before the planes hit?
Yeah, right. It's a good question, but there's no good way to answer it. There are two major possibilities, and I think you hit them both. One of them is that there are about 50 or 100 people, terrorists, and the leadership knew about it. They knew probably the timing, more or less. They knew everything. And the 19 people that eventually died flying their planes into the towers, they were saying their final prayers.
Yeah.
Around the time the data started changing. So you could say, well, that's but the fact is that we don't normally see much happening, no matter how focused and concentrated 50 people are. What we see is a correspondence to huge numbers, millions of people. So my preferred explanation is that just as human beings individually have precognitions or premonitions about the future, and many people have the direct experience of having a premonition and then finding that indeed what they thought might happen or what they felt would come to pass does come to pass. No reason I can see why a global consciousness couldn't also have a premonitory capacity.
So,
and then we've looked at that same question in other data. One of my friends and analysts named Peter Bancel gathered all the earthquakes. This was a long time ago, 2006, I guess, with Richter magnitude 6 or greater. And there were, I think, 600 that in the database that he could find. 500 were in the oceans, so they didn't affect people. About 100 were on land, and the 100 on land showed structure, which was, look, if you just draw this line I'm talking about, instead of going straight, it kind of drops down, and at the time of the earthquake itself, it reaches a bottom peak, and then comes back up and wanders in a normal fashion. In other words, there's a V shape, which starts about 8 hours before before the actual quake. So, excuse me again. I'm sorry.
That's okay. So why would the earthquakes be different than the World Trade Tower disaster?
I'm not sure.
Well, the earthquakes, they look like a V, and the other ones that you described look like a bell curve.
Well, okay, that's a statistical, and it's two different statistical measures. One of them is looking at what we call device variance, which is the integrated variability across the whole list of random number generators, and it's the one that produces this big peak around 9/11. You notice, by the way, that it's not just going up, but it comes back down. It's like a mountain surrounding the 9/11 events. So part of that means there's a positive deviation. The other part means there's a negative deviation. So in the case of the earthquakes, it's a different measure. It's like a second order. It's covariance. Which is, technically just, it's different. It's looking at if you think in terms of something like a mean varies, so that then we have a measure that we call the mean goes like this, and the variance goes like this, and then the covariance is a variability on the variance, okay? So it's a different measure, but in any case, in that case also with the earthquakes, it first goes down, meaning it has a negative kind of trend or correlation, and then it goes back up. And It's the way, it's the nature of the statistic. that's
Okay.
that's the best I can say. But it reminds me of something that a lot of people wonder: what is the meaning of going up versus going down? And it's not it's another one of those good questions for which we don't have a very good answer. There is a possibility that there are two kinds of events: some that produce positive deviation and some that regularly produce negative deviations. And in fact, the likely candidates are events that come at you from the outside, like 9/11 did, or like a natural disaster does. It's an imposition on you. To that, we seem to, for such events, we usually see the positive deviation. Not always, but the tendency is to see the positive deviations. For something like a huge organized meditation, where millions of people, or at least hundreds of thousands of people, are meditating in kind of synchrony, we very often see a negative deviation. It's also strong and clear, but it means that the correlation is, instead of being a positive correlation, all the things are going like this, the negative, in the case of the meditations, with a downward trend in the line that we draw, it means that there's a regular negative correlation between the pairs of random number generators. This is probably way more technical than most people want to know, but it's a good question, and we don't have a very good answer to it.
So
but possibly those kinds of events that are, you might say, driven from within, like meditation is, are the kind that you might say, have what looks like a calming. The variance is smaller, or the correlations are smaller than they should be by chance. Whereas something that comes from outside, it strikes us all at once and arouses our anxieties, fears, and compassion levels. Those kinds of things from the outside stimulate the correlations to be bigger rather than smaller.
So were let's say the top three reactions, if you can break it down, that were Lady Di's funeral, what else were at the top in terms of impact?
Oh, it's a difficult question in part because we're dealing with statistical outcomes, and those are all estimates with big variability around it. It looks like a point. It looks like 3 units of deviation, but because it's statistical, it's 3 units plus or minus some amount. So it might be really 2, or it might be really 4. And so Lady Di, it was 3 units. But if you actually did it again, which we hope it doesn't happen, then it could be 2 or it could be 4. So what I'm saying is that we would all do, including people like me who actually know about it, we take these points, these declarations of significance, or this final statistic, we take it too seriously. So another way to put that is to say, a significant deviation, which is widely thought to be, if it's 0.05 probability, that means 1.6 standard deviations of departure from what's expected. That could so easily be 1.4 or 1, okay, or it could be 3. There's that much variability around this 1.6. So what most of us who are trying to be, realistic, what most of us do is to say, 1.5 or 2 standard deviations isn't enough to get serious yet. 3, you're getting there. That's only going to happen once in 100 times. 4 standard deviations, once in 10,000 times. And the nice thing about repeated experiments such as the Global Consciousness Project is you keep building up more and more and more experience. And that means in terms of these statistical scores, that deviation gradually, even though each individual experiment may only be a small deviation, when you add them up, it becomes impressive at some point. And the 500 events in the global consciousness formal data product sequence has a composite z-score of 7, or 7 standard deviations. That's 1 in a trillion. If you did this experiment 1 trillion times, you might get a result like that. So in other words, at that point, you begin to say, all right, there isn't any doubt that there's a real effect here. Now it's time to start figuring out how and why and what it means.
Before we get to that, what were the other big ones besides Lady Di's funeral?
Oh, it's just, you can sort of think of them, things like the tsunami in Japan, the Haiti earthquake, things like anything that, sad to say, winds up killing lots of people. That grabs our attention. Those things do. But also events like the Kumbh Mela in India. Doesn't happen every year, but they have these gatherings with 20 million people. Some years, I guess. The Maha Kumbh Mela, which is really big, may have 30 million people trying to bathe in the Ganges to wash away their sins. Those have, the ones we've looked at, have added up to a very impressive degree. New Year's is very regular. That's not an important thing in a certain sense, but everybody's paying attention. Everybody's waiting for the stroke of midnight so they can grab their honey and have a hug or lift a glass in celebration. So we all become focused, and we're sharing feelings that are a bit like love and appreciation. And those kinds of things are the most powerful, as far as we can tell by category analysis. That those emotions that bring people together, those are the kinds of emotions that make a difference. Then there's things like Nelson Mandela. When Nelson Mandela died, there was a really powerful effect. I think 3 or 4 standard deviations, 3, thereabout, very clear. But also when Michael Jackson died, and when Steve Jobs died, in all of these cases, for possibly different reasons, there was a huge gathering of emotional or some kind of affect on the part of maybe at least hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people in every one of those cases. For sure, millions in those 3 cases.
What about the 2016?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. What about the 2016 presidential elections with the surprise victory for Trump?
Okay, it was flat. This is, excuse me. I mean, this wandering random trace I talk about, it was not distinguishable from that. And again, because it's a statistical analysis, it could be that if I hope to heavens it doesn't happen again. But in any case, we don't know whether that's an accurate thing, and maybe it should have, was actually the variability around the endpoint of that trace is such that it could be up here, it could be down here. But the direct answer, is that it didn't ring the chimes of the Global Consciousness Project network.
So,
by the way, I maybe just as a bit of context for that, lots of people say, well, World Cup soccer, that's a major event. That brings millions of people together, right? And the answer turns out that it's a little bit more complicated than just making a lot of people, pay attention. There's always, I think, 2 sides. There's Brazil and there's Argentina. There's England. And so we have a competition rather than a collaboration or cooperation. So sporting events, just as a general rule, and we have looked at a lot of them, especially World Cup soccer, because it is huge in terms of the number of people who pay attention. But they're paying attention in a kind of competitive spirit rather in this spirit of love and compassion that seems to be so powerful. They aren't fearful. but they aren't loving. They're excited and they're agitated and so forth, but they're not together in the large sense, I guess.
Ah,
That may be what happened in an election like 2016. The election in 2008 was a different story, very different story. It was very powerful deviation in the direction that we predict. For not only for
after they announced that Barack had won.
Yes.
Yeah.
I guess it's 2007. Sorry. Well, I can't even remember when is the election? 2007. I guess.
Yeah.
So yeah, there are. Oh no, maybe it's the other way around. 2000. No, it's 2008 was the election, and in 2009 in January was the inauguration.
Right. We should know
Hard to keep my political history straight.
I know. Okay, so what does this tell us about consciousness, non-locality, quantum field theory? What goes on in your mind when you try to explain how human coherence can affect the coherence of a machine?
It's magic. I'm not a theorist, but of course I think about it.
Of course.
And I pay attention to what other people think about it. And there are quite a number of interesting and potentially useful models, or you might say theories, but none of them are very easy to test. And so we really don't know. But I'll tell you what I think is what's most appealing to me as a kind of theoretical model and derives from David Bohm's work, where he describes the implicate order as a kind of background out of which everything comes. It's virtual, it's not accessible at all. The implicate order is implicit, you might say. But it is out of the implicate order that everything arises. The particles, the collections of particles, the people, the planets, and so forth, all arise out of this possibility that exists in the implicate order. So one of the beautiful things about his theory is the mechanism for this actualization of the possibility. He talks about a pilot wave, which he also refers to as active information. And both of those mean the same thing. And what they amount to is a kind of structured information that allows the virtual particle or the virtual connection to become actual. So the process is an actualization of the virtual to manifest in reality. So I kind of, my use of this notion is think of the information that we have as human beings thinking about the world and actually structured. We are basically just a structured collection of bits and pieces of reality, all of which were once virtual. So, but the important thing is that we are a source of information or consciousness, which is information in the sense of structure. And so if we think about something like healing, a healer is a source of structured information for a person who needs the healing, who's far away. In Bohm's model about the active information, he says that the actualization occurs when it's needed. If there's a need for this particle to come to exist, then it can be actualized from the implicate order, implicate background as a particle in reality where it's needed. And in a similar way, the healing that's needed by the person who's sick or has had an accident and is now somewhat randomized relative to the beautiful structure that we normally have as human beings, that wounded or ill person presents a need for information that the healer, who may be 1,000 miles away, has in his or her consciousness. So she is envisioning wholeness, healing, and that is a structured, might be, just call it, structured collection of active information. And that active information is needed, and so it can actualize as the structure that's required by the healer, the healee out in California. I wish we could heal the fires that are going on. But I'm thinking about it. I mean, we have been praying, human beings prayed forever. As far as I can guess, as soon as we're able to talk, or as soon as we're able to even wish for something like better weather, so we won't, drown. We were beginning to pray that the weather would be good and provide rain for the crops and some ability to be successful in our hunt and in our lives and so forth. In other words, we've been praying, I think, from the beginning of time. And I don't think we keep on doing things that are completely useless. So it's like a time-tested activity.
But
yeah,
machines don't have any need. So how is it that a machine responds to human vibrations or whatever it is?
One of my friends, and there are several of us actually think the same way, describes that construction of a need as an intention contract. When we design an experiment, we require or request that the random number generator be our instrument for detecting consciousness fields, for example, or for detecting the effects of intention, for detecting the ephemeral, but we believe real effects of consciousness in the world. So a random number generator is, it is, you're right, just a machine. But in a profound sense, it partakes of this same implicate order. And some people talk about that as consciousness as fundamental. So like the whole universe is first consciousness, and then it becomes material and physical. But back to the random number generator, what those things are is a remarkably well-designed instrument which is poised in the now, where its future is completely undetermined. There is no way, not for us, for any expert, for a physicist, for an astrologer, for anybody to predict the future sequence of numbers that are going to be generated, because they don't exist yet. They won't exist until a quantum process actualizes as an electron. And so they're what we call labile. That just means that they have the possibility of changing. So this instrument in changing in this particular case is not just changing from, it's changing from what it might have been. So we don't know what the future is, but it is, this device is capable of absorbing information, we think, in some metaphoric sense at least, so that the next step in the sequence of random numbers will be changed to become what we need, we conscious beings, or what we want, or what we intend.
This makes me think of that question, if a tree drops in a forest but no one hears it, did it really drop? Did it really make a crash?
Right. I don't know. I don't think anybody knows. Although I think probably most people say, oh, the world is physical and material, and so it must make a noise, even if nobody's there to hear it. So I wouldn't want to, try to defend that against a philosopher who had the different view, because there are, you can make arguments for either one. In a sense, it's a little bit like yeah, I guess that's why you asked. You mentioned that is my statement that the next step in the random sequence doesn't exist until it does. And of course, it's not quite the same as the tree falling and a noise occurring and so forth, but it's close. Interesting question.
The other thing that this makes me think of is that quantum mechanics knows that things exist as potential. So whether it's a particle or a wave depends on whether it's observed.
Okay.
So everything exists in potentiality unless there's a focused consciousness.
Well, I'm not a quantum physicist, and I hear those things and I read them and so forth, and they serve as interesting models. It certainly seems that in some cases where you can set up an experiment in a laboratory, the outcome is changed depending on whether there is an observation or not. I'm sorry, I have to
Okay.
go.